I think we are live and we have Dr. Cameron Murray here to talk to us about a lot of things housing economics, corruption, rent control, and also potentially we might get onto some broader questions about economics and economic theory and economics education if we have the time, but we'll see how it goes. Hello, right, okay, I've got my first person in chat, so that means that everything has worked. All right,
Perfect.
so Cameron, I mean, we've kind of followed each other, right, on Twitter or um, economics or the economics blogosphere for like I don't know over a decade, right?
Yep.
And but we never actually had a conversation in person. So I'm really excited to actually talk to you and kind of pick your brains because I know we've got a lot of, I guess you could call them heretical views about economics and about housing economics. So first, if you could just like
Yep.
introduce yourself to us and give us a bit on your background, that'd be great.
Yeah, great. So Cameron Murray's my name. Yeah. And so currently I'm a research fellow in the Henry Halloran Trust, which is an independently funded research group at the University of Sydney. And my main research topic is housing economics and the interaction of planning and housing markets. The reason I sort of landed in this position is in the early 2000s, I got my first degree in property economics. I wanted to be a property developer and make the easy money during the 2000s boom. Um, I did end up working for a couple of developers, but I ended up doing a master's degree, getting a little bit more into the environmental sort of questions, doing a master's degree in environmental economics, and ultimately spent a few years in various government departments after that, and seeing from the inside how the public service operated and the political machinery, I then decided I'd do a PhD on political favoritism and corruption, which I did at UQ with Professor Paul Frieders, who I think's now at the London School of Economics. And so did that for a while, did some consulting work, and yeah, this job came up and it fitted me perfectly. And so I've had the opportunity to just dig in and do some new and interesting research about housing markets. So that's what I've been doing lately.
Excellent. So you talked a little bit about being inside the government machine and being motivated to write a PhD thesis on political favoritism, which eventually became a book, right?
That's right. So the thing about academia, and I think this is, how we met is, or on virtually, is that a lot of knowledge is just hidden away in the journals and in the minds of academics. And the really great thing about the 20 teens and after the financial crisis was, academics talking to each other just directly through blogs and having commentary. And so I was involved in that. And so myself and Paul Fried, as my PhD supervisor, we both saw the value in just getting all this research we'd done on political favoritism. We'd crunch numbers on data, we'd map social networks of politically favored people. We did computer experiments, getting groups to form and steal money off each other. We thought, well, there's no point hiding this um, in the academic journals. We need to translate it for the broader sort of public good. So that's Game of Mates that came out in 2017. There's actually going to be an updated version of that coming out later this year.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I read Game of Mates. I think when it first came out, and there was some pretty hefty figures for how much corruption, or as you call it, Bruce, right? Which is Bruce like? Is that an Aussie like kind of pejorative term or?
No, it's just the most Aussie name I could think of. My uncle's name's Bruce, and he
Okay.
is the most Aussie guy I know. And I'm just like, this is the guy who's, in a singlet and thongs in summer in Australia. He gets up, he goes to work every day. He doesn't want to follow politics. It's just, family, friends, having a good time, working hard. Um, so Yeah, so the book's written basically. There's a character called James who's part of this well-connected elite network, and then there's Bruce who's totally detached from politics. And every time, in every industry, James has rigged the rules in his favor, and so things that should be shared socially, that could go to Bruce, like taxing oil the Norwegian style compared to the Australian style. Well, our character Bruce misses out. It was just a way to sort of tell what's really quite a bland, technical sort of story with some very abstract ideas to just get you thinking of a character when you come across and go, oh yeah, that politician in my area is a bit like that, or that property developer in my area as always seems to, have his finger in all these political pies. Yeah. So that's that's how the book is, Game of Mates. Yeah.
Yeah. So Bruce is like the kind of everyday character, and James is James like what is that like the posh name that you could think of or
Yeah, basically, just some kind of posh name. But what's most interesting is that, we just had a stand-in, James. I'm like, let's just start writing and trying to see if it would work. And then one of the first chapters is about property development in Australia. And of course, when you enclose a bit of land, you have to come up with a system for divvying up who has the property rights to that land. And it turns out that the very first private individual in Australia to own private land, his name was James. So that was convenient. His surname will come to me in a second. So I thought, well, that's a good way to explain why our character is James. James got a lot of favors, a lot of land given to him from the governor when the land title system was first created in New South Wales.
right? So I mean that kind of links to something that I wanted to talk about with you, right? Because when you're talking about divvying up property rights, uh, I think it's clear from your work and not just Game of Mates, but like what I've read from you over the years. One of your main points is that there's not really a neutral way to do that, right? It often favours certain groups, and it's always a legal process. So maybe could you talk us through maybe a bit more through that example you just mentioned and how it's actually done in a way that favours elites in Australia?
Yeah. Oh, look, there's property is a really tricky concept to talk about because everyone deals with property every day. So there's a lot of intellectual baggage. We all think we know what it is when we see it, right? Um, so uh, I guess yeah, the point is property is a system of carving up the three-dimensional space and providing exclusive rights to certain people over exclusive sections of that space. Um, that's the sort of how I see the property system. And so, anytime you change who has rights to do what in any particular part of the space, anytime you make a public investment that changes the value of one space instead of another, what you're doing is making a discretionary decision to sort of allocate economic value to someone instead of someone else. So let's think about building a train line to a certain area. That train line will be publicly funded from the collective, whatever the distribution of taxation is in the economy. But the beneficiaries will be very concentrated on the landowners who already own land in that corridor. And what you find in those sort of situations is a lot of gaming, for example. So when a railway line is at an early stage of design and discussion, well-connected insiders will go and they'll take options on land that are near the proposed train line or one of the investigation corridors. What they'll do is they'll try and steer the process towards having a train station where they already own land. And so what you're doing is you're saying, well, certain people own certain parts of the world, and what we're doing by our public choices is increasing the value of some people's sections more than others. And that also relates to systems of planning and zoning. So you can think about property as a system of rights. So inside this three-dimensional space we've carved out for you, we apply the law, essentially, the set of rules that say what you can and can't do. And people have this idea that it's absolute. Property's mine, from the center of the earth to the sky, which it's obviously not, because you can drill a tunnel underneath someone's land and you're not trespassing. You can fly a plane over someone's property and it's not trespassing. You can, in Australia, you don't own the rights to any minerals under your soil on your land, for example.
Mm.
So the rights are all limited, and planning is one of those things. And so, for example, if it's in this piece of property or space, the rules say, you can build detached housing, and then we decide for some reason we want to change how the city grows, we can change that rule and say now you can build high rise. And that has a value, that new right that is granted to that person in that piece of space. And you could sell that right to them. You could create a separate piece of property called this is a right to build high rise in an area currently designated for detached housing. And you could auction that and sell it.
Mm.
But what happens in disguise in the planning system is we just give it to you for free, and it might be worth, $25 million in just one sort of decision. And I looked in my PhD thesis at 6 major rezoning decisions just in Southeast Queensland, in Australia, and found that the value of property rights given through rezoning in those 6 areas was $710 million, of which when I looked at the political and social networks of landowners, so I scraped all the corporate databases of cross directorships and biographies of politicians and the donors and the professional lobbyists, and I mapped this network with over 12,000 individuals and companies and over 250,000 types of relationships between them. What you found is that if you got that beneficial rezoning, you're much more likely to be well connected politically than someone next door or across the road with otherwise identical land geographically and in terms of location. So, the conclusion there is that it's actually the political connections that determine that this new valuable property right was given through the zoning system to the property owners in this area rather than just next door. So that and when I was working in property development, that's the main game, right? Buying one set of property rights and waiting for the rules to change to get a more valuable set. That's where the big money is. It's not in actually constructing housing. That's very risky. You just want to own the land when the rules change in your favor. And that's why those political connections are so important.
Wow, yeah, that's really interesting. There's a lot of things I want to talk about in what you just said. So I mean, yeah, I mean, what strikes me is that it was a process for you of observing this, right? In reality, observing the actual corruption and then being like, right, somebody's got to study this. Which is kind of like the opposite to what a lot of economists do, where they're more like, well, this is how I think things might happen according to my theory or whatever, and then I'm going to go out and apply my theory. So yours was much more motivated by like actual experience in the real world as a property developer.
Yeah, I mean and to be honest, that's been my approach since then is you know, there's a lot of debate at the moment about housing supply being constrained
Mm.
and that's why houses are expensive. Something we should definitely talk about.
Mm. Yeah.
But, I worked for these developers and I remember this was an industrial developer. They bought a large plot of land and that was ready to go to subdivide into large industrial lots.
Yeah.
And they said, well, we could do that. Or alternatively, we could apply for a business park type, higher density, higher value type of subdivision and project that is currently not within the rules, but I'm going to, try my hand because the planning scheme has this legal flexibility. And I remember the big boss saying, yeah, well, there's no point me, doing a low value industrial subdivision. It doesn't matter if it takes me 10 years to get the rules changed. It's going to be worth it. So they were there, able to do an industrial subdivision instantly
Mm.
and get approved, at the end of the month and start the bulldozers. But they chose instead to wait potentially a decade or more to get a higher value return. And that's one of the key issues in property that you need to understand. And especially it comes up now in the US, there's this big YIMBY movement. Oh, we've got to unleash the market to decrease prices. Well, the market doesn't want to, prices to go down. Property owners aren't foolish, just like because they own an asset and that asset goes up in value over time. They don't have to sell it to make money, it sits on their balance sheet. If they make more in the future, they're trading off, do I develop now or do I develop next year when prices are higher? And that gradient, on how much the return is to delaying is determines how fast the market will supply. And that's actually, something I've been studying a lot recently. I don't know. The term is land banking.
Mm.
I don't know if that's the same term in the UK, is it? For developers who hold large land banks, but then supply at a rate to make sure they're not depressing the price and maximizing that value over time. Is
I
it
think
is it
so.
called land bank?
I think we call it land banking here. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, so the Georgists will be very happy about everything you've just said, or excited, I should say, right? Because it speaks to this like difference, the fundamental difference, right, between perhaps housing or land and other assets, because you can just hold on to it, right? Any other asset, even a durable one, like a car or a fridge, is gonna depreciate. So you don't have as much opportunity to land bank, right? You can't land bank with apples or cars or something because they're gonna lose a lot of value. But land, if anything, like you were saying, right, gains value. So it doesn't matter if you loosen the planning restrictions, because ultimately the restrictions are coming from the private investors who are saying, no, I don't want to do anything with this land. I can hold on to it, and the present discounted value or whatever formula they're using, that's going to be higher if I hold on to it for 10 years, leaving it, doing nothing
Yeah.
with it.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. You don't want to undermine your future returns by building something now. And you're right, I think it's something a lot of people struggle to comprehend, that the property, the land, well, we call it land, but it's really three-dimensional space, right? You don't own the soil necessarily, you don't own the minerals. You can dig all the soil out and stick
Mm.
it somewhere else. You still own that big empty hole, right? Um, so, you've got to differentiate the location and the object that you put on that location. So, it's probably best to think about the housing market as if all dwellings were caravans, right? On wheels. And we go, well, if that was the case, we wouldn't say we have a housing shortage because, you can build caravans wherever you like. We have a pricing issue with the system of how we allocate places to put the caravans, right? That's what allows property markets to rise with the sort of average incomes of society rather than get bid down over time like produced consumer goods quite often do. So yeah, you got to have that distinction in mind, and people confuse it. For example, a question that often comes up is, well, housing developers are in the business of selling houses. That's how they make money. I said, no, they're not. No. That developing a house is one way to transform your rights to that three-dimensional space into cash. It's one way, and it requires a lot of your own cash to build the physical structure, to sell it to the market to get other cash back. Yeah, but a better way to do it is to just wait and convert it to cash sometime in the future when the potential development is much higher and the value is much higher. Because all you're doing, right, when you're developing property is you're swapping one asset, undeveloped land, for cash on your balance sheet. And the question would be, why would I be in a hurry to convert an awesome asset like undeveloped land that's going up probably 25 to 40% in value per year right now for cash, which is getting 2%, and which I'll have to go and outbid someone to put it back into land again, right? So you've got to think about it as an asset rather
Yeah.
than a consumer good, and you've got to separate that, that right to the three-dimensional space. That's the asset. The building, it
Yeah.
does depreciate.
It's a completely different way of approaching it, I think, right? Well, it's certainly a different way of approaching it than kind of ignoring it, which I guess you could say is what conventional economists have done, right? There's capital and there's labor and there's
Yeah.
no land. There's not necessarily anything special about land. But if they were to approach it, they wouldn't necessarily think of it as a financial asset in the way you have, right?
No, no, that's right. There's actually an author, I'm thinking about who it is. I think it's this book here. It happens to be right on my shelf. Economists and the Powerful.
Oh, yes.
I don't know if you've read that one.
I have, yeah.
And I think I don't know if it's this book or it's something by Michael Hudson, but it makes a case that the rise of sort of modern neoclassical economics was actually politically motivated by the elite networks to undermine the popularity of Henry George, who obviously put property at the front and center. In the late 1800s, I think 1890s, there was a big property market crash, especially in Australia, that massively boosted his popularity. And obviously, the landowners thought, well, I don't, we've been making easy money for a century. We don't want a big political movement rising up to distribute that property wealth. What we'll do is we'll finance, like think tanks, economists and universities, and we'll give land grants to universities to create these departments that will explain how land is like anything else, and private markets are the best way to allocate land. So,
Yeah.
that some people have that sort of history. You're right. And the Georgists, yeah, I would say I'm a sort of modern interpretation of many of the core ideas of Henry George for sure. But I think I'm taking it a little bit further with, modeling these dynamics, this intertemporal asset dynamics, which everyone had observed for centuries. The property market cycles, the boom and bust, the problem of, progress and poverty, lots and lots of wealthy landowners and lots of peasants who can't afford to live anywhere.
Hmm.
That's part of the dynamic. But I think I'm working on now ways to integrate that and communicate it to, your neoclassically trained economists. And it's had a pretty reasonable reception because, it does fit, it does fit the simple economic story of, if you make more money in the future, don't close off that option by developing now.
It is, in a way, it is like kind of a basic economic idea, isn't it? What you're saying, right? Or it should be, but it is like again kind of ignored by economists. There's also the book, was it The Corruption of Economics by Mason Gaffney? I think that goes
Yeah,
into
I think that
detail on
might be the
Henry
one.
George.
Yeah.
I can't remember. To be honest with you, I read Economist and the Powerful best part of a decade ago, so I can't remember. But they might talk about it in there as well. They probably do. But I think the original
Uh,
source was Mason Gaffney, right? I've
I
got one
think you're
question
right.
in
Yeah,
chat
yeah,
for you.
yeah.
Somebody said,
Great.
just popped in. Gaston Ehrman says, I've just popped in, but this is not true for cities, right? Because all the land has already been used to build stuff. So what do you think of that?
Well, mostly that's not true. I mean, every piece of land when you build a building on it is used up, right? So you could, you know, for example, if you look at Australian cities, if say, let's just collapse the space. So we've got the city centre here and the fringes here, and we've got this sort of radius, right? It's not the case that the city only expands on the end. It's the case that actually the distribution of new dwellings looks like that. It in fact grows like this. Because what happens after a certain amount of time, um, buildings that were the highest and best use, the most valuable thing you could do with land in a what used to be the urban fringe, are now very low value and totally ripe for redevelopment because you've got this very low cash flow and this high maintenance cost from the existing building. At some point in time, it makes sense to then flip that and get on a new curve through time of higher value development. I mean, look at New York City and Manhattan. It's the construction just does not stop there, right? The incremental and that sort of step change redevelopment site by site occurs. Now, obviously, things like heritage protection will stop that in certain areas, and in cities like Paris, where that's quite extensive, what they do is they essentially build a new commercial center for the city, and that's sort of planned at a city and state sort of level. But it's not the case. And what I find quite interesting is that you know in Australia, of all places, housing developers keep saying there's a shortage of land. We can't build anywhere. We need all this rezoning. But if you look at their balance sheets, they've got 70,000 approved and undeveloped lots, and they're targeting 3 or 4 thousand sales per year.
Yeah.
They own it. I, all they want is new rules that make it more valuable before they actually develop, because that's where the big payoff is.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I mean, we were talking about the YIMBY debate, so maybe it's a good time to talk about zoning, right? because it's a huge issue online, and I have like some YIMBY tendencies in that I kind of number one, I think there is a specific context in the US where there's this whole history of big race divides in zoning, right? And there's kind of suburbs that were literally made for white people, right? And there was redlining, and there were black communities, and I think part of it is that persists in today's kind of zoning laws, and people are saying, well, abolish those or change them somehow, right? So I do support that. I also have an inclination that I'd like to see more housing built. Right. So there's the
Yeah,
YIMBY kind of ethic, which is to say, I
yeah.
don't mind if there's more housing built near me, even if it disrupts my view, because I want people to have homes. So I agree with that, I think. But then I think what you would tell me is, well, rezoning or the type of rezoning that YIMBYs are talking about isn't necessarily the best way to do that.
Uh, yeah, so my view is quite subtle, and I think the problem is once you get a popular movement like the Yimby NIMBY stuff, subtlety just doesn't cut it anymore, right? Very hard to cut through. So my view is very subtle. One, I like having more homes than fewer homes. Like that's gonna be good, right? More space, better, newer dwellings than less space, older, crappier dwellings. There's no way in which the second option is better.
Yeah.
My concern is that the YIMBY type approach relies on an assumption about property markets that just has never been true. It has never been the case that the distribution of ownership in a system of property rights has improved dramatically through only the functioning of that private property market. It always tends towards concentration over time. And partly that's because, the system is a monopoly in a way. Property, they say, is the original word for monopoly.
Hmm.
Um, so I think it's a bit misguided to expect the market to deliver more quickly than it would have anyway at slightly different locations with a different zoning system.
Yeah.
Now, it's important to remember, right? Zoning doesn't regulate the rate of supply of new dwellings. That is the number that you can build in a year. Zoning regulates what types of dwellings get built in which locations. So, an analogy to, for example, a road is that zoning is like the lane markings. It tells you if you're traveling this direction, you have to be on this side. If you're traveling this direction, you have to be on this side. But if you're within those lanes, you can drive as fast as you want.
Hmm.
Any application made will be assessed and approved as quickly as possible. And we can see in the planning system, right? You get a market downturn, people stop wanting to build because that's the market incentive to not build, even though you can, when the market is thin and when the prices are falling. And then you see a boom and you can approve, 5 to 10 times as many dwellings because 5 to 10 times more applications were made, right? You didn't change the rules anywhere to allow this to happen. It was always able to occur. It's just that the market incentive wasn't there to make that application. So I'm also personally a fan of higher density. I think it's just an efficient way to grow a city.
Hmm.
Um, so, I live in an area that used to have a bit of industrial and a bit of detached housing, and now it's got sort of between 7 and 12 story residential towers in a lot of the industrial, but the detached housing sort of protected through heritage type rules. And it works fine, right? The catch, of course, is that people get concerned about, well, are you going to build the infrastructure to support this? Because I
Hmm.
used to be able to drive down here or use this park, and now you've dumped, thousands of new people in the suburb, but there's been no upgrades to anything, and that's certainly very common in Australia. We had a huge construction boom in Sydney and Melbourne in the 20 teens and in the 2000s in Brisbane, and that's one of the main concerns. So I think planners themselves, you know, could navigate this political tension between existing residents and the opportunities for new residents by being a little bit more um, uh, committed in the planning system to, for example, the delivery of upgrades to the public realm that are required for a higher density suburb. So you might write into a plan that, you know, we'll approve up to X thousand new dwellings in this area. And when we hit that, we won't approve more until we built this park, and the council will be penalised
Hmm.
for not building it and keeping up, you know? And if you can tie a system like that and get the trust of the people that, yeah, that's going to happen, I think you're never going to win over everyone, but I think the warranted densification that cities should have might go over a little bit more smoothly politically.
Yeah.
But I also warn you, like you know, the construction of housing in Australia, there's more bigger, better dwellings per capita than any point in the history. So we have fewer people in bigger, newer, more air-conditioned houses, massively bigger than any point in history. And so it's a little bit puzzling to say, oh, it's because we didn't keep up with supply. Like we've been outdoing population growth for half a century. This is not a sort of post-World War II physical constraint on dwellings because everyone who built houses went to the army.
Hmm.
No, we actually have heaps. In fact, if you look at China, nearly a quarter of every single dwelling in the country is vacant.
Wow.
So between 23 and 25% of every single dwelling that is constructed, it's built. There's no YIMBYs, no NIMBYs, sorry, but they're vacant. Prices are high, rents are still high, because you got to think about it, the property as being an asset, right?
Yeah.
Across all alternative asset markets, some just has to go into property, right? And if you can buy a new property to park some money in, you buy new money, and you can think of these as little floating empty bits of airspace on the balance sheet. They just sit there because you need to diversify your balance sheet. That's one of those interesting puzzles, right? Is that the more expensive properties become, the more vacant dwellings there's been. So if you look at Australia in 2000, the census was 2001. I think 5% of all dwellings were vacant. And then the census in 2016, it was 12% of all dwellings were vacant
And
on
prices were
census
much
night. So
higher
we could
as well, right?
yeah, yeah, much higher. We had a massive 2000s boom, right?
Hmm.
So, and then in 2016, we'd had a 2013 to 16 sort of boom as well in Sydney and Melbourne. So we have this interesting puzzle that prices are highest they've ever been. We've got more better dwellings than we've ever had, but there's more vacant ones than we've ever had. And again, one of those, resolving that's a challenge, right? We got to think, well, again, we're at that point. Well, housing developers make money selling housing, so why would they delay? Let's put on that hat. Why would a property owner makes money from the property? Why would they not rent it out? Well, my best explanation is sort of relates to options, right? It's the same sort of thing. Well, an occupied dwelling is one type of asset, and an unoccupied dwelling is another type that is more flexible for sale, for renting at a different price if the market changes, and it gets a slightly lower return. It's a more liquid version of the occupied dwelling. And of course, the more liquid asset would have a lower return. So if you're in a world of high asset prices and where the capital growth is a very large proportion of the total return, that liquidity might be worth giving up that small bit of net rental return. Yeah. So that's probably part of the story. I don't know if it's the whole story, but again, if you switch your brain into property as an asset class, people park money in property, it's an asset rather than, no, property is a newly produced good and service. That's what, we're going to sell it to make money. That's then
Yeah.
you go a bit wrong in your thinking.
I mean, it goes back to this way of thinking of essentially almost every market as basically governed by the same rules, right? And thinking of, like you said, housing is just another good. You produce more of it, the price goes down. People want it more, the price goes up. But land and housing markets, I think, are like one of probably the primary candidates, along with the labour market, right? Where I would say that kind of logic is incomplete at best.
Yeah, yeah, it is incomplete. Although, even when you're teaching economics, I don't know what your experience has been,
Hmm.
but what's a supply shock? How do we teach a supply shock? We got to go, oh God, well, someone accidentally built a new factory and expanded capacity. even though there were no sales, so they had to drop the price. It's very hard to concoct an example. So typically we fall back on oh, it rained a lot, so we got more apples that season. And apples, there's only limited ways to delay the sale of an apple. You can dry it, you can can it, you can put it in apple pies, right?
Yeah,
There's limited ways to delay the sale, so you decrease the price. So that's a sort of
yeah,
supply shock classically. But no one's around there. Oh, gee, it rained a lot, so all these extra houses bubbled up, and oh, what are we going to do? We better flood the market to clear it because next year we might get an even bigger crop
yeah.
growing, right? It's very hard to concoct it when you're in the world of big, expensive capital assets. And the way I try to explain why we don't get supply shocks and why the market doesn't get flooded is, housing is build to order. You don't just build dwellings and go, gee, I hope someone comes along and buy this. I spent $500 million developing this new estate. No, you build it. Oh, I'll come and buy one. Okay, I'll sell one. I'll come and buy one. I'll sell one. It's a little bit like building ships, right? You don't just go and build oil tankers and just hope there's a market. You wait, you get your order, and then you build to the order. And that's how it works in property. That's why they have pre-sales to judge whether there's enough, market depth to actually take a whole building in one go. They'll sell one building, it will be completed in 1 month, like the completion date, but the sales probably occurred over a 5 or 6 year period, right? As you build, you're fulfilling those orders over that period of time with that one building.
Yeah, I mean, I've always had a suspicion that that type of economics is probably best applied to farms. And it's funny that you use the example of apples because you always get that. What's a supply shock? Well, it's the weather. That's the best thing we can think of. Possibly war. Sometimes you hear, but it doesn't make as much sense. And there's no such thing as a kind of shock, as an external shock, right? When you're dealing with such a long and complicated process, whereas you said like housing is built to order, it just doesn't make as much sense. I mean, my favorite somebody mentioned in the in the chat is technology shocks, right? Like, I mean, you get that's kind of similar where I don't know, all the computers just stop working or something like that, and I really don't know what a technology shock is.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to do a quick sidetrack into, general economic theory of supply and competition, but generally I think that's, coming up with a new type of product to fulfill the same need with fewer resources. It's very, I'm a big fan of this monopolistic competition type. It's a bit muddy, right? The way these processes work. And I think when we simplify to this, it's a supply shock in a competitive market. I feel like we're not really helping anyone. Yeah, it's a little bit too simplified.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that's been occurring to me, and a couple of people have mentioned it in the chat, is you've talked a bit about rezoning, and basically what I'm hearing is that you want to attach obligations to the rights that developers get when they have a claim over land or some kind of property. Right now, they get that claim, they get the returns from it, they get the control or power over the asset, but there aren't really too many corresponding obligations. In fact, they get given them for free. So apart from kind of the rezoning and attaching these obligations like public services to them, which you mentioned, which I haven't actually
Yeah.
heard that as a suggestion before, but it makes a lot of sense. But apart from that, I mean, what kind of solutions do you think there are? Because land value tax has just sort of been in my mind since we started talking. So do you think that's a solution, or are there other ones as well, or instead?
Land value tax is great. Go and do a land value tax. In the ACT, the Australian Capital Territory, where Canberra is, the capital of Australia, it's a little territory like a state. It has its own government, and it's in the last 10 years transitioned towards land tax almost, as their main source of tax revenue, away from stamp duties, which are a transaction tax on property. So they've done that. It's fine. But the land tax does change that dynamic trade-off a bit, right? Because if the property value goes up, you pay more tax in the future as well as today. So, it can go, well, I could delay and build something bigger. But while I'm delaying, I'm paying all this tax in the future as well. And so that's going to change the incentive to build a bit faster now, even if the prices go down a bit. So it does do that, but I just don't think these effects are that going to be that huge overall. I think the big selling point of land tax is the distribution is fair. And when I say it's fair, it falls disproportionately on people who have land, who have rights to do something, and who aren't using those rights, sitting on undeveloped land. So the way, yeah, you disproportionately charge them, so they're like, okay, well, I better make use of this space that this society has given me exclusive access to.
Mm.
So that's the big selling point. It's a fair distribution. Um, but in terms of, you can only vary how much the rate of supply changes in a year. And the market does that to some degree. I think if you want to make big inroads into home ownership, into the cost of housing, you need some kind of public investment on the supply side, some kind of price regulated price way to get housing, right? Not a market price way to clear that market. And that's historically how it works. So, for example, after the Second World War in Australia, I think from 1955 to 1972, home ownership went up from 49% to 72%. And of course, it's fallen from its peak in the 70s now to 65% at the 2016 census. And so, what we've done is, in the free market era, home ownership's fallen off. In the heavy government involvement of doing land subdivisions, public funding for owner builders to go and build some land, there were huge rent controls on private landlords, which obviously incentivize them to sell because they got this asset they can't do anything with. They can't put the rent up, right? So better to get the cash and go do something else because you're also in an expanding economy after the wars, lots of places to put that money outside of the property market. Um, so yeah, that's pretty much how every country gets home ownership, right? It gets there through collective public programs that allocate people their little space
Mm.
without pricing it at market prices. If you look at Singapore, for example, their home ownership rate's about 90%. It was 23% in 1960. They went from 23 to 90%, or it's 89%, I think. 23 to 90%. Like,
Mm.
Singapore, it must be because they're capitalist, free market. In fact, no. Obviously, Singapore has the Housing Development Board, which has built more than 80% of every single dwelling for the last half century in Singapore, and that gives every Singaporean the right to buy at a discounted regulated price a property from the Housing Development Board system. And so that's how you get it. Mass public development allocated to people at below market prices. And I think, land taxes are great. I think they're fair, awesome ways to raise money, and they do have intertemporal incentives to actually, use land more productively. Um, but if you want to get from 50% to 75% home ownership, or 23 to 90, and you want to massively reduce the out-of-pocket costs for young people trying to buy housing, you need to be a bit more radical than that, in my view.
Yeah, so I mean, this is nice for me because I'm just having basically all of my opinions confirmed by you. Because my first policy in the housing market would probably be to build more public housing, right, available to the population. Simply because, I mean, everything you said aside, all these very intricate nuances, it is also the most direct solution, right? Like, people need houses, build them for them. Not everything has to be super clever and counterintuitive, right?
Funny you say that. A friend of mine, I don't know if you've seen him on social media, Dave Sliger.
Mm.
He's a funny guy, and I said, you know, we've probably come up with 50 of the worst ways to make housing cheaper and get more homeowners. Why can't we just build houses and give them to people who don't have houses at a discounted price? Like, if this was medical care, so when Australia introduced public healthcare, right, there's debates for nearly 2 decades. You can't just give people free healthcares. You can't just build public hospitals. We have to have this system of private insurance and rely on churches and the goodwill of doctors to allow, patients who aren't insured on the weekends to get treatments. That's we got to do everything we can to make that system slightly more efficient. you know? And there's debates for years. Oh, maybe what the government does is they subsidize private health insurance. It's like what the Americans are having their debates about private health insurance now. And so I find it funny, there's a lot of think tanks and groups who, they sit next to each other at a desk. One person looks at healthcare and goes, yeah, just, build public hospitals and, give people treatments for free. And then the person in housing's like, oh, do a rezoning, but have a social housing levy, but then have an income contingent this. And I'm like, just give people free housing, man. Look at the guy sitting next to you. He's telling you the solution. We've been doing it in healthcare for decades and decades. Everybody loves it. So yeah, it's a funny old thing, I think. And yeah, Dave's point is that simple policies don't sell because if it can't be just that we don't want to do it. It can't just be politically we don't want to do it. Here's a simple answer. It's got to be, oh, it's a really tricky problem. We really want to fix it. We just don't know how. We've got to get another research report from some economists.
Yeah.
So we end up, we've got 7 states here who every 2 years come up with a new housing strategy. Great glossy report, done by an expensive consultant. And then they go and talk about their strategy, and then they write another one 2 years later, and there's this same number of houses. They haven't done anything. They should have paid those guys to build houses instead of writing reports.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's maddening. It's maddening.
It is. I don't know if this is a bit unfair, but sometimes when I read recommendations from economists or any kind of policy expert, one of my thoughts is, well, is this recommendation basically giving you a job continued into the future? Is it not in a corrupt sense, just is it giving you more work and more prestige? Or is it actually something that could put you out of a job, right? Because I think often it's like, yeah, when you say it's so complicated, more research is needed, all of this type of stuff. Oh, we wish we could. It's just like, we wish we could solve it, but we can't. It's just a bit of a conservative impulse, isn't it? And it just ends up with more reports and fewer houses.
Yeah, I'll tell you a funny story. They call it the homelessness industrial complex in some areas, right? I had someone contact me who'd been reading my stuff online, who'd been working for a homeless organization trying to get people off the street. And she said, look, I don't know if I'm going crazy, but I've read your stuff about political favoritism, groups, corruption, housing. She said, I don't think these people want people off the street because if there's no homeless people, they don't have a purpose anymore. So all the effective, immediate solutions are made into complicated, slow things that allow them to, keep existing in their organization. Because the last thing that organization wants to do is lobby for policy that destroys its very purpose. And tell you another story. Recently I've proposed that Australia copy Singapore's housing system, and I've called it housemate because the current trend in political policies is job keeper, job seeker, home builder, these conjoined words. So I'm like, housemate, that's an Aussie. Everyone has the right to a free house or a discounted house from the government, just like they do hospital services. And I was talking at a community event about this, and there was someone in the audience from Singapore. And she said, oh, I really like that. Yeah, Singapore's pretty good. I've just come from Singapore. I'm a social worker, and we don't have any homeless people, so I had to come here to help homeless people.
Right.
Yeah, that's, because, and it's not like there's no social work. Singapore has a system, but they have a public organization whose job it is every day, keep an eye on people, get them into housing, make sure they're trying to, apply for, they're looking after themselves, keep an eye on that. Like they have a system. And she's like, well, they have a system, it's working. There's no one on the street. So I came here.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. No, I think I've had something similar. Somebody say they came from Sweden because there were no problems in Sweden. I mean, no, there are problems in Sweden, but they said there weren't enough problems in Sweden, so they came to the UK. So yeah, it is just it's kind of a similar thing. So yeah, I mean, one thing I kind of wanted to talk to you about, and you did mention it earlier in your suite of policy recommendations, was rent control, right? Now, you and I have both produced things on this, and it's an extremely controversial policy among economists.
Mm. Hmm.
According to some economists, it basically destroys cities, right? There's an Assar Limbeck quote, the best way to destroy a city is through bombing, the second best way is through rent control or something like that.
Hmm.
So I was just wondering what you think of that, because it seemed to be part of your policy recommendations.
Yeah. Okay. Um, so rent control. So firstly, on the, there's no disagreement amongst economists about rent control.
Hmm.
It's me and you and five people in the world versus the whole
Josh
discipline.
Mason.
And oh, that's right. Yeah,
Me,
that's
you,
right.
Josh Mason. I think that's about it.
And I'm sure we've convinced, three other people each as well. But um, the thing about groups, right? So, my other hat, one is housing and one is networks of groups and political favors and how groups form by repeating favors and signaling to each other and wearing the right clothes and how you form social groups. And so economics is a social group, right? That's what sort of academic disciplines are. And so groups have a set of myths and stories, their legends, right? Their Bible that they tell each other and they recite to each other. And those myths and stories are elevated to be sort of like the meta binding identity of the group. So if you believe all this, we can disagree about other things, but we've all got to agree about this, and then we'll have these debates. You've got to agree the Bible's the word of God, and then we'll disagree about the interpretation. So in economics, we all agree that rent control is bad, and then we disagree about why it's bad and how, whether it's be worse than bombing or second worse compared to bombing, right? So when you get this unanimous agreement in a group, it either means one thing, it's a super obvious thing and everyone should know it, or two, it's a taboo subject and people are afraid to have a debate about it, so they go along with what the group is expected to say. And I think rent control falls in the second one. And we know that because, if you think about these incentives for developers, right? Okay. So where do we start on this? Why don't we start with that study that came out of rent control in Berlin? Was it
Yes.
last year or the year before?
Yeah, it was last year, wasn't
And
it? Yeah.
yeah, and so it was quite interesting because essentially they found things like, yes, rents went up more slowly by less than half as much as the unregulated rents. They found that people didn't move as much. There was also that study, I think Rebecca Diamond 2 years earlier
Hmm.
of San Francisco, was it, rent control? And she found that, rent controlled buildings get redeveloped quickly, expanded, demolished, redeveloped into condos. And that's interesting because the standard, the myth or the story economists have is that if you're rent controlled, you limited your return on that property, so you don't want to put any more money into it because that money you put into it doesn't allow you to increase your return. Yeah.
Hmm.
But in fact, modern rent control is actually not like that. It's in fact the opposite. Okay. So if you, for example, are in Germany and you have what is, it's sort of like uh, there's a limit on how much you can increase your rent based on the council's sort of market reference number each year, right? But if you invest in your dwelling by renovating it, you can change and jump onto a new tier of a regulated rent. So in fact, the only way to make more money in that case is to improve your dwelling,
Hmm.
right? So the opposite of what was assumed in the very simplified, oversimplified story. The other case is that, well, rent control limits how much of a return I can make in future years from this dwelling. So if I have other investments that can make more, I will sell that dwelling to go and put my money in an investment where I can make additional money each year. And of course, the only way to get more home ownership is if landlords sell to first-time buyers, right? That's the only way you can do it, right? You can build new homes for first-time buyers, but those landlords still need tenants. So it's probably easier to think about just a single stock of dwelling, because we only build, 1 to 2% new dwellings each year. It's such a small amount. Um, so, even if every new dwelling went to a first home buyer, you're going up at 1% per year, that sort of thing, in terms of home ownership. So rent controls is a good way to make being a landlord a bad investment relative to other things and get landlords to sell to homeowners, and that increases home ownership. So, I think if we had this chat, say 15 years ago, I probably would have come up with all these reasons why rent control was bad.
Mm.
And I would have done what other people do. For example, I think it's Rebecca Diamond. In one paper, she says, "Oh, rent control allows people to stay where they are, it makes them less mobile, which is bad, right?
Yeah.
People aren't moving, and for some reason, I'm just going to say moving's good." And then in another paper, she says, "Well, rent control means people get to stay where they are and don't get kicked out, which is good." And it's the same thing. It's just you got to sell it as bad because it's a good thing and it's rent control. So economists don't want to hear good things about rent control. And you find a lot of those contradictions. I think your video had just a segment of good things called bad things. And I think when I
Yeah.
reviewed that paper, I think I called my blog post, you know, um, calling good things evil, the economics of rent control.
Yeah.
You know, um, but you know, I mean, the rent is controlled. It's controlled by property owners, right? Who have the power to set the rent. It's not like we can avoid setting a price, right? We've created a system where the price is set through the operation of this property system, right? And we can create a different set where different prices are set, different system where different prices are set. And yeah, there'll be different incentives for people within it, but you've got to add up the costs and benefits. Isn't that economics? Right?
Yeah.
Um,
Um,
you know,
yeah. Thanks. You know, that
so
was.
and
Sorry,
go.
your video was frozen for a little bit, but I actually think it's okay. Everyone was saying the guest isn't moving. No, but you're okay now. Sorry, carry on.
No, no, no. I'm pretty done. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
just one of those cases where things that have existed in the world for a long time and have good benefits, tangible, measurable ones. We just it's a taboo topic. We can't talk about it.
Mm. Mm.
Uh, and again, it harks back to that um, you know Henry George idea and Mason Gaffney and how economists are sort of trained to ignore the contribution of property to the distribution of wealth and
Yeah.
production in the economy.
There's a great paper by oh god, I hope I get his name right. It's a 1994 paper by I think Arnott in the Journal of Economic Perspectives called what is it? Room for I can't remember. Room for re.
Richard Arnott, it would
Richard
be.
Arnott, yeah, room for reflection or something
Arnott.
like that about rent control, and he's saying, look, maybe it's not so bad, but it doesn't seem to have made that much of an impact, despite being a very good paper. I mean, I completely agree with you. I think, you get this very simplistic view, right? I mean, what I talked about in my video was like Econ 101 and taking just the very basic demand supply model. And putting a kind of a price ceiling on it, right? And
Yeah,
and then you get a reduction in the supply of the thing. Now,
yeah,
like you said, second generation rent control, which we sometimes call it, where there's all sorts of allowances and contingencies, you can't even put that on that diagram. It's just too simple. And one of the things that bothers me, and this applies to the minimum wage as well to a lesser extent, is that economists know that, right? In their seminars, they know that, right? If you said, "Oh, demand and supply," if I went into a housing economics seminar, I said, "Here's the basic demand and supply model, but we know this isn't good enough for really understanding housing markets." Everyone would just be like, "Yeah," they wouldn't say anything. Nobody would object to that. But then once it comes out into the wider world, and once you get not just academic economists, but kind of people who like economics or who fancy themselves as economists online,
mm,
then all that nuance is lost, and it's just rent control is bad, despite the fact that the basic theory just can't even make sense of the policy. It can't. You can't have second generation rent
yeah,
control on that diagram.
yeah. Look, I think we might have had this discussion online once before, but I think I view it slightly differently there. I think you can use this diagram. I think you just need two of them side by side and a relationship between them, which, a lot of markets with externalities, we use two diagrams. A lot of interactive markets, substitutions, we use these two diagrams. Because the thing about rent control is that you can only apply it to a building that's already built, right?
Yeah.
You can't rent control the future, right?
Yeah.
And so once a building's built, it's been built for a reason. It's been built to order. Someone has, justified that investment based on the current rents. Yeah. So after that point, the return that justified the investment has been made. Any variation in rent because of other market conditions, because the government builds you a train line to your suburb, whatever the case may be, that's rent. That's economic rent. That's a freebie. You didn't have to invest anything for that. So if housing was any other type of monopoly good, we would regulate it with rent control and say this is the way to get an efficient outcome. So I used to work for the state regulator in Queensland called the Queensland Competition Authority, and we did rent control regulation on train lines. We did rent control regulation on power lines because we said, well, once you build this, the price that you are receiving to conduct current or charge trains was sufficient. And so we can set that price in stone right now and let you run as many trains as you can at that price. In fact, it was revenue cap, right? So if you have fewer trains, we let you get a bit of return to share that risk. But, essentially we let you have that price, but what we don't let you have is more afterwards. And if you can't get enough trains, you have to expand, right, at that price. And if you expand or upgrade, we'll reassess your investment and let you get a return on that additional investment. Just like in rent control, right? You built a building, you've got residents in it, they're paying a rent, we'll cap it. If you, for some reason, need to invest more, we'll let you get a return on that additional investment. And so if houses were any other asset, we would totally regulate it. And the same economists who say rent control is bad in housing will say price control or price cap regulation in infrastructure is efficiency enhancing. It's just exactly the same logic, exactly the same system. And I think the problem is that people are trained. Maybe we should talk about pluralism and economic teaching, but it does come back to this idea that economists have is competition is about the numerical number of people in a market. And I think that's totally wrong. It's not about that. It's about free entry. Even if there's two competitors, if someone else can show up and enter that market, it doesn't matter. If there's one, but there's people on the sideline, they may have defensive pricing to stop a competitor coming up. It's that entry. The property market, right, can't be competitive no matter how many people own it. So I'm going to test an analogy on you and the audience, and I'd like to know if this makes any sense. Imagine, the property titles office. Do you call it a title or a deed in the UK? The piece of paper that says, I own the land between these coordinates.
There's a deed.
And, so-and-so has a deed. Yeah, so we call it a title. And we have a titles office. There's only one, right? And the titles office is essentially the company that owns the three-dimensional space. And those little records are who owns a share of that three-dimensional space. And they go, well, here's your share. Here's your share. You can't go and start a property titles office and go, hey guys, come to my property titles office. I'll give you the rights to the CBD, right?
Yeah.
You can't do it, right? You have to go to that same one, that same monopolist and go, can I have the rights to that? And I'll go, no, I'm sorry, I've sold those. You have to go get it off them now, right? So the analogy then is, if the property titles system was a company owned by one individual who owned all the land, and instead of property owners, they had a managerial layer in their organization that decided how and when to build what, in what location, we would say that's a monopoly, guys. That company is a monopoly. Your internal, even though your internal managers get to make decisions independently across different locations, that's a monopoly. We could publicly list that monopoly and we could all buy shares in the land titles office, like company shares, stocks, and it would still be a monopoly, right? Even if there's 1 million shareholders. because it's one title system. It owns all the land. It has all these managers of each location. It's a monopoly. You can't compete with it. You can't start a new title system. However, we've tricked ourselves because we've said, oh, you shareholders, what we'll do is we'll say, if you want to be a manager of an area, you have to be a shareholder.
Mm.
How about that? You have to own a share and then you become the manager of that area. Well, we're now in private property competitive, but mechanically, we're exactly the same as a great big company who has local area managers who owns everything, right? The mechanics are the same. I still can't compete in the property market without buying space off, a manager of this property titles company. And that's where I think, pardon me, we have our downfall is we've been we've almost convinced ourselves that, oh, there's thousands of property owners, therefore it's competitive. I'm like, well, thousands of people own, you know, the Telstra, which is our sort of telephone monopoly, doesn't mean it's competitive. We regulate the price on it, right?
Mm.
In fact, millions of people own it, just little parts of it, just like millions of people own little parts of the property title system. Doesn't mean the system isn't a monopoly.
Yeah.
And, if you could compete with housing by not having to buy a piece of the three-dimensional space of the earth off someone who already owns it, oh, we're in a different story. We're in a competitive market. But, you do. If you want to park
Yeah.
your caravan or your house somewhere, you've got to buy it off someone who already has those rights.
You
And
need
that's,
permission
I
from the
think,
existing market participants, right, to participate in the market, which isn't the same with your average business, your average commodity.
well, you can take this thinking much further and go, well, actually, it kind of is, right? If I want to grow something, I have to participate in a,
Mm.
property market, a land market in the farm. If I need an industrial warehouse, I've got to participate there. So in a way, what we're relying on and where I sort of see the benefits of this is I have to innovate to minimize how much property I use in my production.
Mm.
That's the only way. I have to come up with technical inventions and ways to do things that minimize my use of property. That's the only way I can sort of enter markets and compete across all markets. So I have this very nuanced view that has been evolving for decades now that yeah, okay, it's a rent, but is it that special? Because, if I produce a car, I still have to buy steel. That steel comes from a mine, from a guy who's got an exclusive right to mine there, and is charging me the market price when they don't need to. Um,
It's a
so
completely different view of competition, isn't it? That you're developing, still seem to be in the process of developing as well. Yeah,
yeah, well,
I
I
mean,
don't,
I liked that spiel, by the way, for the record, as feedback because you were testing it on us, right? I thought it was good. So
yeah,
I don't know what people think
that's
in
why I was
chat.
rambling. I was rambling, but I need to write this up cleanly. And I have done one, if one person owned all the land, but we owned shares in it, would it be a monopoly? If our shares were associated with a physical piece, would it be a monopoly? Yeah, it's something I think is a real mental barrier for communicating my ideas more broadly, is getting over this idea. But yeah, it's competitive. People will just go and supply stuff. You know, it's a huge mental leap. And when you're on the other side, whoa, you can start looking at things differently and tearing apart new ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Yeah, so just to backtrack and slightly defend myself or clarify something that I meant when I said you couldn't put second generation on the rent control on the simple demand and supply diagram. What I mean is literally that one. Like you can't just have that basic one with second generation rent control. What you said
Yeah,
is
yeah,
you can add another one, and I would say yeah,
yeah,
sure,
yeah,
but that moves beyond econ 101 inverted commas. And another comment on that is
yeah,
that as you were talking about monopoly, right, which is because there's econ 101 and there's econ 101, right? You learn about monopoly in econ 101, and if you do price controls with a monopoly, then it's beneficial. Now that doesn't have to be true the same way the basic model doesn't have to be true, but
mm,
it's just to say that there's lots of different ways of approaching this. They lead to different solutions, so let's not be dogmatic about what type of economics we need to use. Which I guess segues nicely
yeah.
into pluralism if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, let me just say I totally agree with you on that. And my attitude, is no one's 100% right about anything. Everyone's on their journey like me, And some people are very far ahead of me on some topics, and I learn a bit about that. And then sometimes they're totally off base on others, but it doesn't matter. I just learn what I can from different areas. But on that, supply and demand, I guess what I'm trying to say more so is not that the view on rent control came from uh, this belief. I think it's the reverse. I had the belief first, politically motivated, and I've reasoned back to Econ 101.
Mm,
That's what I'm trying to say.
mm.
That don't underestimate economics is very politically connected, pardon me, discipline. So don't underestimate the sort of political and social motivations that lead to, all this reasoning, whereas you know, it, it's made to appear that the reasoning led to the political conclusion, but quite often it's the opposite's the case. And I'm not saying I'm not guilty. I have my, different views on different things, but it's worth being aware of that when you read very broadly on political topics.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be a little bit less generous than you. I mean, when I'm talking about something like rent control, right, and how ingrained the belief is, I get the feeling because people are so dogmatic and unwilling to have a conversation about it. It
Mhm.
actually, not only is it quite a strong intellectual commitment, I actually think for some people it makes up about 25% of their personality, like opposition to rent control. I just think they define themselves by it, like, and it's just honestly, I find it very difficult to have a conversation at all.
Well, I think you've just stumbled onto something that's true in general, and I guess where I was going with this, once an idea becomes a political movement, it becomes part of your identity, and then all hope of nuanced discussion is lost, You then, you're against rent control, but you're for rezoning and you're a YIMBY, whatever.
Mm,
And that becomes your identity, and everything reasons backwards from those beliefs, right?
mm,
Whereas, when you're deep in the thick of it, like me, and when you're reading lots of different types of approaches to things, you can sort of go, yeah, rent control, I could take it or leave it. It's not the only way to address anything. Um, I think what would happen is this, that would be good. These would be the bad things. The costs outweigh the benefits in these situations. You can look at the nuance, but because it's not your identity, you know, it's harder to get, as you say, it's 25% of some people's identity. And that's hard to let go, right? It's hard to not have a group or an identity or, push for something you believe in. It's hard to just be that guy plodding around, not really knowing, trying to pick up the next bit of information. Like when I write like I know everything, right? But in reality, that's what I think I know now, but
yeah,
I'm gonna just keep keep plodding along. And I look what I wrote 10 years ago. I'm like, oh yeah, it's much more subtle than that. That's not quite right.
yeah, yeah. No, I don't like reading things I wrote or produced a month ago, let alone 10 years ago. Like, God, you idiot. But
Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, yeah. So this is a nice segue into pluralism, right? Because I think what we're touching on here is the dogmatic conception of economics and economics as this set of kind of rules or laws, right? And you can't disobey the laws of economics, demand and supply. You have to, advocate this set of policies, otherwise you don't understand economics, which is something that, I mean, my pseudonym is Unlearning Economics, right? I'm very
Mhm.
committed to trying to extinguish that kind of dogmatic view of economics. And I know that you've done a lot, and you've got resources available. Maybe I can post them underneath this video when it's uploaded for teaching economics in a less dogmatic way.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. So, look, it's really hard, right? Probably what I want to say first on pluralism. Yeah, economics is actually quite a broad church. Um, there are definitely, schools within it and different areas where you can and can't say certain things. But in general, my experience has been at conferences and events that there are useful concepts in there that help people communicate and
Mm,
help progress learning. Substitution, optimizing, the opportunity cost of this and that, there's a lot of good ideas. Um, but as you sort of say, the details matter. Like there's a good idea, supply and demand, and then there's the detail of the real world. And and it's hard to get a handle of that because, in property there's one issue, in another case there's one issue. There are the welfare implications, like do we care about well-being and welfare? Is that even a thing? Can we measure it? Um, so look, it's a really hard journey, and I think I've been sort of on the same journey as you. When I worked in the government departments, and I'm like, oh, okay, learning about how regulation works in practice to compared to theory, for example. I did a lot of reading very broadly.
Outside of economics, I'm
I
guessing
pro
as well. Is that?
uh, economic related
Yeah.
ideas. But for example, when you get an economics degree, you don't really know how the national statistics are calculated. How do we know what the occupancy rate of dwellings are?
Hmm.
How do we know? How do we know how many dwellings there are? How do we know how many people there are? How do we know what the consumer price is? Is it sensible to have an index of consumer prices? You
Yeah.
know, in economic theory, there is the price level, but that's all prices, right? Labor, assets, consumer goods. There's no price that's not in the price of theory, and yet consumer prices, we then impose this production economy where we go, oh yeah, bank fees are in it, missiles are in it, imputed housing rent for owner occupiers is in it, but the imputed rent of, or yeah, the imputed value of driving your kids around instead of getting a taxi, that's not in it. The value of cooking at home, that's not in it, but the value if someone else cooks you is in it. Um, if I mow my neighbor's lawn for free, that's not in it, but if they pay me, it's in it. You know,
Mm, yeah.
um, you do get a bit of exposure, but then, I started reading up, how is this calculated? How do we know this?
Yeah.
And it really takes you back to the basics. You've got a toolkit, but you just, one of the, I learned a lot from Steve Keen, just sort of breaking down that, these optimize, these equilibrium, models, they barely work on their own assumptions, if at all.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, oh, okay. So is this an attempt to just generalize some phenomena, but it's not, we shouldn't take it too seriously, the actual model when we tweak it, because we don't really know the details. We're just trying to generalize that something goes up when something goes down, right? And this is one potential way.
Yeah.
So he helped me along. The modern monetary guys, they
Sure.
helped me along talking about, how do banks settle transactions and why is there M1, M2, and M3 different types of money? And and why is M1 so high, but we don't have inflation, even though, the what is it? Friedman's sort of
Yeah.
monetary hypothesis says it should be. And then you go and you just read the central bank's processes. They publicize this is how we clear at 5 p.m. and this system tells
Yeah.
this person this, and then this bank does this, and these people have these accounts, and you're like, oh, wow, that's exactly not nothing like what's in
It's
the textbook.
completely the
And
reverse
I've
of what you're taught, right?
yeah, so what I did in this journey is, well, every time I learnt something that was verifiable like that, and if it conflicted with the textbook, I'd tell students, don't read that chapter, it's wrong.
Hmm.
Read this instead. This is from the Bank of England, this is from the Reserve Bank of Australia, this is money. Because that textbook's nonsense. I'm going to just show you here,
Yeah.
which is, I think, for a lot of people, that's people in academia, they're socially, at low risk people. I think standing up and saying, oh, this famous guy, I would like to be impressed by me who wrote this textbook we're all using. That chapter's completely wrong.
Hmm.
I'm better than them because I actually read this stuff. This is how the world works. Here's some material. It takes a you got to be a little bit arrogant in a way um, to
Yeah. I've been
do
I've been
that.
accused of being
Uh,
arrogant many times for doing things like that. I mean, I
but
don't know. Maybe I am. I don't know.
yeah, I think you need it. You're not going to get intellectually curious unless you're kind of arrogant. Like I want to know more than the other guy. I want to,
Yeah.
I don't want to stop. I just don't. I don't want to be satisfied with your story.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't. Sorry, I don't really believe you. I'm going to keep digging. Um, it's a it's it's not always a good way to get people to like you.
No,
So there's a
certainly
risk.
not. I mean, I couldn't
Um,
agree with you more about some of the examples you used. I mean, I'm a big fan of and have uh, taught GDP statistics to first years because you just firstly it teaches them what like how to work with data, which you don't get enough of in economics. You get increasing amounts of statistical techniques actually, but the gathering of the data still I think is way too absent and not rewarded within the profession. So you teach them about that. What do these statistics actually look like? They learn what GDP actually means, but then you get them to ask these questions like why, how do we count finance in the economy? Why has that changed over time? You know, why is, like you said, you know, cooking at home not counted, but if I go to a restaurant and order the exact same thing, that's counted. And you start to ask questions like, you know, what is the economy? And you realize that that's kind of contingent. And that opens your mind a little bit, as opposed to just drilling them with certain theories and just saying that's economics, and then they end up kind of a bit stuck in those ways of thinking.
yeah, I'll give you an example. Right, a very timely example. So you're totally right, but it's then very hard to keep that in mind day to day in the press. GDP went up, CPI went up, uncritically. These are the, this is meaningful. And you've just come out of an economics course, you're like, oh, it's pretty arbitrary at the end of the day. Take
Mm.
it with a grain of salt. So it's very hard to keep that skeptical attitude going when you're bombarded every day, but you should, because if you look today at the inflation scare that's going around, there's a lot of lessons from today. People will say, we've put too much money in the economy, but mostly the inflation is, used cars and things that need microchips and, a few construction materials. It's surprisingly narrow, right? And so the question's got to be, well, how does the demand side theory of inflation um, get you only inflation in used vehicles and building materials and not
Yeah.
everything else, right? Like,
Mm.
so, but I've probably put it out on Twitter a few times. The US is like, oh, we've got all this great inflation, but their consumer price index is made in a completely different way to ours in Australia.
Yeah.
We don't have used cars in our inflation index, but they do. Their used cars are 3% of the inflation index, and used cars have gone up 40%. So 3% of 40% is what that's contributed, right?
Mm.
0.12% or whatever over the last 12 months. Um, we don't we don't have that. So our
Yeah.
CPI is never going to boom as much as theirs because literally it's a different measure.
They make a
And
lot of
so,
quality
you know,
adjustments in the US as well. There's a lot more of this hedonic pricing, which is just basically saying, you know, if computers are better
yeah,
now than they were, then we're gonna change inflation. So they do that the most in the US. We don't really do it in the UK. I'm not sure what it's like in Australia.
so we do it for consumable audiovisual and computing equipment.
Hmm.
They're trying to do it for new cars, but it's fairly limited. But then that's another question, right? So the audiovisual equipment part of the CPI has fallen like 90+% in the last 10 years. But of course, you can't buy the same product from 10 years ago in the shop at 10% of the price today. You can
Yeah.
only buy today's goods, and today's goods are the same price. They're just better. You
Mm.
know, you
Yeah.
can't, if your TV was $100 20 years ago and it's gone down 95%, there's no $5 TVs around, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But you're telling me the TV is 20 times better,
Mm.
right? But in the price index, oh no, it's only $5, you know? So, just having that in mind and but it it's useful for today, right? So now I can make predictions that other people wouldn't because I know how the CPI is made and why it's different. They also have imputed owner-occupier rents in the US CPI, which is like 28%.
Mm.
We don't have imputed owner-occupier rents. We only have market rents and the cost of new construction. And so our housing weight is only like 22% instead of 28%. So there's another huge chunk that's
Yeah.
missing. So the US might get 8% inflation this year. If the same thing happened here, we might only get 5%,
Yeah.
right? And you only know that. There's probably now our audience, you, me, and 50 people in the country that actually know that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but it's useful. It's really useful. And I think economists should be trained to actually be able to go and dig around. And as you say, learning the national accounts and how to go and get the data and dig around and see how it's made. I did that in my master's course.
Yeah.
I did a master's degree. I did that quite a lot based on this household survey we do, dug around into all the weights and the way that survey is created. So I sort of that was a lesson for me to then how to go and dig in every area where I'm looking for data. Um, so yeah,
Yeah.
I think it is important uh,
Yeah. By the
to
way, just to let you know, the viewership's been pretty good for me. I mean, usually it's me playing Age of Empires 4 quite badly, so it's less interesting than this. But this is like 160, and it has been consistently for a while. So it's quite a big audience. So yeah,
yeah. Say good day everyone in the comments.
yeah. Good day, everyone. So yeah, sorry, I got a bit distracted there. But yeah, no, so
Yeah, we're
yeah,
just talking
this
about yeah.
critical perspective on statistics, right, can give you a critical perspective on economics as a whole. I mean, if there was one very simple takeaway, I would say from the audience that from what we were just saying, it's that cross country comparisons of like macroeconomic statistics,
Oh my God.
please do not. Oh, Germany's more wealthy than the UK or less wealthy. Like the way these things are measured, Josh Mason actually has a very good. Oh my god, we just got so many good A's, by the way. We Germany has a completely different system, ways of measuring wealth. Josh Mason's post on this is
Yeah.
really good. Just don't believe somebody who starts making these very ad hoc comparisons, like inflation here's like this, inflation there's like that. It's just going to be a completely different way of calculating the statistics, not to mention a different context from which they're coming, right?
Yeah, yeah. So I'm totally with you on that, and it's really hard. Economists want simple stories, simple comparisons. Um, the world is not that simple. I mean, there's some good rules of thumb to navigate the world, but one of those cases, I think there was a lot of chat last year or the year before about comparing poverty globally, right? This whole story. I think you had a video on that. Was that
Yeah,
you?
yeah. Oh,
Uh,
poverty statistics are. Oh.
Yeah. So, and the idea that less than $2 a day, but $2 as in like $2 a day living in the America
Hmm.
is what it means, right? I'm like, no one can live on that. No, like the actual produced goods and services to eat, to clothe yourself, and like it's no one actually stands up and goes, yeah, it's actually impossible, right? It's impossible that there's a country. It's impossible for humans to be alive on that few amount of resources and calories, right? Um, so there must be something else going on, and it's kind of obvious when you think about it.
Hmm.
Just go to America and see how many people can, let a quarter of the population live on $2 a day, and just see, it's it's going to be chaos. They're gonna
Yeah,
they're gonna um, end up with non-market production to sustain themselves,
yeah,
right? And so quite clearly, $2 a day, what you're measuring is market production, and what you've inferred doesn't really make sense. You know, there's a lot of information lost along the way. And yeah, it's great that that number's going down, however it's estimated. Um, but again, you're not measuring. Like just like in a Western household, right?
hmm.
When I clean the bathroom, I could pay someone to clean it, or I could do it myself. It's
Yeah,
the same production, right? But that's not counted,
yeah,
right? So if we all paid each other, if my wife paid me and I had a business cleaning
yeah,
my bathroom in my house limited, we'd we could go get 10% GDP, right? Like in
yeah,
the US, you know, the new European GDP standard in 2012 said, illegal drugs and prostitution, that is a newly produced good and service. It's not a market, it's not in the regulated sort of formal market, but it has a price and
hmm.
a value. So what we're going to do is make all the member countries come up with an estimate of the value of prostitution and illegal drugs and put it in their GDP.
Yeah,
What we're also going to do is we're going to reclassify military weapons from consumables to investments. So we're going to add the cost when we build them, and then when we blow them up, we're going to add that value as a consumption item with an imputed rate. It's mad, right? Once you go down this line of reasoning, you've just got to be like, hang on, can I trust
Yeah.
anything. And my rule of thumb is, in relatively short periods of time, you can trust changes in trends, right? Of a single country using the same method. So a single country using the same method for a decade, if something goes up and down, whatever that represents conceptually probably went up and down.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. I agree.
comparing, you know, for example, comparing inflation in the 70s to today in Australia, right? Everyone goes, oh, inflation was really high then. I'm like, yeah, but mortgage interest was in the inflation and it's not anymore. And mortgage interest was really high. So, um, in that measure, you're counting a whole thing that is not measured anymore,
Hmm.
as 14% of your CPI weight. Of course, it's going to be higher than it is now. Um, so it's even hard to make that comparison in the long run for one country using a very similar method over 50 years.
Yeah. I mean, well, relating it back to the poverty statistics as well, I think it was maybe Lance Pritchard, I can't remember, who said, well, if we're going to have the dollar a day, it was previously the dollar a day, now it's 190 a day, but the poverty line in US dollars, why have we not calculated it from poverty rates in the US? So they've done this kind of Frankenstein's monster type thing where it's in dollars and you've got to convert using inflation statistics, which we've already discussed, but in a very poor country where they don't even have established statistical institutions, it's even worse, right? You're getting your statistics from like one firm or something. Or, that's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but a really small non-representative sample. Some cases the data doesn't exist, and you end up converting that, and you use some combination of different poverty lines in different countries. This is how the poverty line was originally designed, and it's just garbage in, garbage out, right? Where did this line come from? It didn't come from proper, careful consideration of what poverty actually is. It came from basically statistical convenience or convenience with data, and you're almost tempted to say laziness.
I think you're right. And I think it's also partly a bit of intellectual superiority of economists. They like to have clean data that they can do fancy techniques with.
Mm.
So if you went around measuring poverty by interviewing people, asking old people how they grew up and compare it to young people in that area, looking at the conditions and, tabulating and recording and documenting things, case study type, qualitative analysis and documenting all that. And, you can do some averages and statistics if you want, but you're not going to be able to do anything fancy. Um, I think you get a lot of information,
Yeah,
but that's not really that well rewarded in economics. I can't
that's an
see the
understatement.
American Economic Review. Imagine the American Economic Review, right? This journal everyone wants to get in. Imagine you went around to a dozen developing countries where the poverty measure was meant to have gone down a lot, and you went and you just documented and you interviewed people and you took photos of them and you asked them how big their house was and what it was made of when they were young and where they live now and
Mm.
where they went to the toilet and how much they ate and what and you sort of tabulated that and you had pictures and you put it in the AER and say this is what poverty looks like. They'd be like, show me a new time series method, right? Like
Yeah, yeah,
it I'm like, but I can't, I've got a bunch of immeasurable things. I've measured lots of different ones and I've tried to um, provide the best information I can about what I've learned from actually going and doing the legwork. That's all I've got. Like everything you do in addition to this with your numbers is made up from
yeah,
this onwards, right?
yeah,
Like this is the information.
yeah,
Everything you make up from now is just your assumption about my information.
yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah,
there's a bit of that.
more qualitative research, I think, in economics is absolutely crucial. And I mean, one guy who's really good on this is Morton Jervin, who wrote, was it Poor Numbers and also Africa, a book about
Africa by
Africa,
the numbers or
Africa
something.
by the
Yeah.
numbers. Yeah, and just about how you need to understand the context that these numbers are coming from, and it gives you a bit of a different picture. So at a basic level, GDP can rise because of kind of something that we might call actual economic development and growth, or it could rise because of a commodity boom, or it could rise because of a change in measurement, right? And you're not going to know that necessarily just from like the aggregate statistics and running advanced techniques from them. The best place to learn about it is to actually, for example, go to the country, talk to the people there, talk to the people who work for the government, talk to ordinary everyday citizens, and all the rest of it. So yeah, it's just. I mean, it's a slightly different topic, but somebody said, I think it was Janet Yellen, she said in 2006, if you'd wanted to publish just the balance sheets of Lehman Brothers and a bunch of interviews with them in the AER or any economics journal, really, you wouldn't have got published. And yet that would have been one of the most useful things you could do in the field of economics at that point, because it would have shown that something was wrong, right?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. And so these are the types of lessons I apply these days is like just get on the phone to the person who makes the data, right? And get them to send you stuff. Um, get them chatting about, all those, in every organization, there's these things that are wrong with the system, but you don't talk about because they're really hard to fix, right? You don't publicize them. When I worked in the competition authority, one of those things was we did an audit on whether the rail operator preferenced their trains against others. And I'm like, that'd be really tricky to do, wouldn't it? And like, yeah, well, we just ask. We just ask if you preferenced your own company. There's nothing we can do. We say we can do it, but we can't. It was one of those great secrets, right?
Yeah.
And so, that's what I do. And I call, so I do a little bit of consulting work. I did after my PhD. So I did, for example, a report about trophy hunting in 7 sub-Saharan African countries and that sort of economic value. And the numbers were all over the place. So I just emailed all the agencies and just got direct line of contact and said, how do you even know this? Did you just make it up? Like, you can't have that many resources. And then you can get to the bottom of it and go, yeah, well, we rely on this other aerial survey that so and so did 10 years ago, and then we estimate based on this. But yeah, it's just, and
It,
I'm here, you know, if I was this well-trained economist, I see this published number and I'm like, yeah, that's the number. Whereas now I'm like, it could be the number or it could not be the number. We don't know. It's the number that they had to produce a number and that's what they put up, right? So then but you can then flesh out, well, this is a number, if you want to put it out, but you know, you can then do some sensitivity and say, well, it could be here, it could be here, because we actually don't know, and so let's deal with what we don't know, rather than pretending what we do know.
absolutely. Yeah. It makes me a bit angry talking about this for too long, because it reminds me of what economics kind of could be, and versus what it actually is. And I really would like to do things like that, but I know that they're not rewarded, right?
Yeah, and I don't know how to change the system, right? I had high hopes for a while that most systems don't change from within, right?
Mm.
That's why I'm very into the sort of Austrian, um, you know, this ecology of free markets. If one organism dies, it makes room for others, and things change and evolve. And I
Mm.
think that happens with organizations, and so economics as a discipline. We're not just going to change. We're the top dog, right, in social sciences. We're not just going to go, oh, we're not good enough. All the leaders of our discipline are actually, just sort of, the high priests that just say the same stuff. They're actually not that interesting. Um, but it can change from without, right? If there were groups like INET and others, trying to come up with a little bit of a, external group. And there's in the US, there's groups trying to start new academic institutions and things like that. I think that's how things change. But I do, there's a lot of really good young economists. There's a lot
Mm.
of good economists just generally, but it's a very big discipline, right? And there's a
Yeah.
lot who just, did the 101, work at a bank, work at the treasury, uh, teach 101 in academia, stick to a limited number of topics. And, um, you can't expect everyone to know everything,
Yeah.
and I think a bit of respect for the different types of knowledge in economics, someone who's good with the surveys, someone who's good with other techniques, someone who's good with qualitative
Mm.
assessment, and someone who's good with interviewing. There's that book Asking About Prices. I think it's Alan Blinder, the
Yeah,
author.
yeah,
Basically, the question is, well, how do prices get made, right? Well, let's go and ask companies who set prices for their products, right? Totally revolutionary
yeah. And there's
idea.
also
And
Why Wages Don't Fall in a Recession by Truman Bewley, right? Which is basically the same thing, but for wages. And it just, that to me, I mean, there was somebody in chat saying that we sound like we want to be sociologists, but I think that's what we're talking about, right? Because it's defining economics as quite a narrow method. For me, economics, right, going and asking businesses how they behave, interviewing them, studying them, if that isn't economics, then I don't really understand what is.
yeah, look, I think a, there are a lot of broad-minded economists who read sociologists and who read other disciplines and all the industrial organization guys.
Hmm.
Um, you know, I, a lot of the time, what ends up happening is you go and you learn from another discipline, and then you bring it back and translate it into economics and say, I've discovered something. Or you
Yeah,
take, you know, that's a bit flippant, but you do need to communicate it to other people in your discipline, right? And I can't just go and use the jargon of sociology communicate to economists. I can borrow some methods and I can apply them and I can translate them. So I think that's good in a way. I think that's really good for the discipline and to get people used to it. But then then you get the attitude of, well, I'll wait till someone else, incorporates those ideas into
yeah.
economics before I take it as true. I think being actively interested um, in other approaches in your field is definitely worthwhile
It's a
as a general
value,
rule
isn't
of
it?
thumb.
It's like, or it's a culture shift, right? It is like about having a certain attitude towards reading broadly and being willing and able to engage with other methods. I mean, I think in terms of a good example is behavioral economics, right? So it's very much bringing things from psychology but putting them into the mathematics that economists are used to. And I think overall it's been a good thing because now you've got all much more appreciation of non-rational behaviour, and but at the
Yeah,
same time it can in the long term reinforce this view of economics as until somebody's put it in a utility maximization problem, I'm not going to pay attention. So I mean, it's a structural problem, it's a systemic problem, right? You need to have different ideas of what constitutes economics and different things rewarded and taught within the profession.
yeah, I agree. I think, no discipline's going to be perfect. No discipline's going to have everyone, happy to read everything about everything else. But I think you know, just promoting the attitude of reading um, across fields. Now, of course, that's not rewarded in academia or anything, but economists are not too bad at it. But in some ways, my personal view is being the top dog of the social sciences, governments don't go and ask social sociologists, what policy should we do for housing? Rarely. They'll ask economists that what policy should we do for trade or regional development?
Hmm.
You know, so economists have this sort of, I think, standard they should aspire to that
Yeah,
should be a bit more rigorous than other disciplines because of this social responsibility that somehow we have got as a discipline. Mm.
I completely agree with that. I'm gonna have to wrap up soon because I have to do my actual job in about 45 minutes. Have you got time to stay for a little bit of Q&A? Because the chat were asking a couple of questions.
Yeah,
All right,
yeah, let's do a few questions. There are
great,
another 15 minutes for sure.
cool. So YouTube account asks Cameron, can you talk about the economics in Australia and the current government's economic approach? Nothing in particular, just generally. So that's quite broad. You might want to narrow it down a bit, but you probably have some things to say, right?
Look, I think the smart thing is not to think one side of politics has a major difference to the other and separate what's spoken about politically and what's actually implemented. Most of politics is hot air. Um, mostly in Australia, both parties have the same underlying philosophy. I've spoken to left, Labor politicians, and they'll just tell me, well, it's not the government's business to be involved in housing anymore. Okay. Well, you're the left party. What do you think's going to happen? Right? Yeah, just get market outcomes, the same as we had in the 1800s. Every boom and bust cycle we've had since Australia was discovered, and that occurred in the US and the UK for centuries. Um, so I don't think they're super different, and I just don't pay attention to that. Everyone just wants to give their mates money and tax people who aren't their mates, and that's, I think, just how things are going. I don't have any big insight on that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I wonder if Australia's unique in that regard. I mean, obviously it isn't in one sense, but I do wonder if that problem is especially big in Australia, the kind of corruption problem that we opened with because of
You
historical
know,
reasons.
well, I mean, look at the US, right? They got a democratic federal government, and a lot of the time, what you end up with is promising, you know, policies in opposition, and then you know, saying why the government is so powerful and risking so much by doing what they're doing, and then you get in there and say, "Oh, it's too difficult for us to do that. Um, so we'll do something else," right? Like
Yeah.
this is just the political game. I think you have to have a real strong filter on that. My view is that either side of politics could implement any policy on any day of the week if it fitted in with the polling and the political problems that they faced on that day.
Hmm.
I could get the right of politics to do a public housing program. I could get the left of politics to do it. I don't, I just sell it in a different way, right? But the same actual fundamental physical construction and pricing of things would be the same.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's how I see it. I don't see there's enough of a difference to say only this government would do that, only this what government does that. I think it's a lot more opportunistic and less grounded in any sort of economic principles.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay. Next question is Custard Lemon, who asks, this is a good question. Why is it house prices have risen in all the English speaking countries at the same time? Do they all have essentially the same housing policy?
Yeah, well, I mean, private property markets are the system. Well, it's not even just English-speaking countries, right?
Mm.
Germany's booming. Singapore, even their public housing sector is rising in price because they have a secondary resale market. It is global. So interestingly, in May 2020, I think I did a podcast with my mates at Nucleus Wealth, and I argued that house prices were more likely to rise 20% than fall 20% in the next 18 months.
Mm.
And just before we did that podcast, all the major banks had come out and said, "Oh, we're preparing for house price declines of 30%." It was all over the media, prices falling, people panicking. And I said, "Well, actually, I have 9 reasons why that's not going to happen." And I went through, I acknowledged there's cycles. So, the Georgists are very into property cycles. And
Mm.
I said, well, we've just had essentially a bust from 2017 to 2020. We don't have busts after busts. We
Mm.
have an outsized stimulus. People have more money than they've ever had. We have a lower interest rate. So everyone's saved on their home loan. They've prepaid principal at a rate that they could never do before. Renting money is half the price of renting a dwelling. So we're going to see a huge shift into renting money instead of renting dwellings. And anyway, I went through and that's what happened. I even bought a house that year, and prices boomed more than I even thought. But it's predominantly the interest rate, right? And if you read central bank um, documents, they will explain that, and this is also in the economics textbooks.
Mm.
Monetary policy transmission mechanism. Well, where lower interest rates means people can borrow more for the same repayment to buy a house.
Yeah.
When prices go up, people feel wealthier. The wealth effect lets
Mm.
them leverage to borrow money to buy a boat or a four-wheel drive or whatever else they want to do a renovation. And that is what stimulates productive activity in the economy. It's right there in the textbooks. It's right there in the central bank documents that,
Mm,
oh, we reduce interest rates to raise house prices. And
yeah.
here we halved interest rates essentially. Mortgage rates in Australia went from just under 4% to about 2%. And that just already declined from 4.5 to sort of 3.5 to 4 in the few years prior. So I went through all these reasons. I showed that, uh, the mortgage balances to income had fallen after the financial crisis. It was also true in the US. The balance sheet recovery in the decade since the financial crisis was really thorough.
Yeah.
And so there was so much financial firepower. I'm like, it's not going to collapse. People have a lot of money right now. They've paid off a lot of debts. Anyway, people said in May 2020 that I should give my degrees back. I got it from a cornflakes packet. If this is what universities are churning out, it's a waste of money to get an economics degree. Basically name calling and all that social media stuff.
Yeah.
And what do you know? Just being right doesn't pay sometimes.
Mm,
So that's it. It's low interest rate policy.
yeah.
We've decided that macro stabilization policy occurs by manipulating housing markets. And
It
in
is.
Australia, we
Yeah.
have variable mortgage.
And it's
Yeah.
it's ingrained, right, isn't it, in yeah, countries across the world. It is central bank policy, right? It's monetary, a lot of monetary policy. Certainly before the crisis. I mean, now we have other things like quantitative easing, which are slightly different, but the interest rate manipulation going through the housing market is the policy, and that's hard to dislodge for a lot of very complex reasons, right? Political reasons around how people's homes are their now number one source of wealth in these countries. Reasons we were talking about with experts who want to keep their jobs at the central banks, and there's so many different reasons that's ingrained. So yeah, thanks. That's a really good answer. I've got two more questions for you before we go. One may be relatively short. It's quite a direct question. The other's a bit broader. So Andrew Paul asks, and I've never heard of this idea before, what are the chances of negative mortgage rates in the next 20 years? Not the cash rate, retail mortgage rates.
Oh, hi Andrew. How you going, mate?
Oh, do you know him?
Um, if it's the Andrew Paul I know, yeah, I
Okay.
think I think we've had this conversation on Twitter. I think last year, 80% of new mortgages in Denmark had a negative interest rate. The average rate, including all fees and charges, the effective rate was 0.8% or something like that. My view is long term, unless there's some fundamental political shift or revolution, monetary policy is here to stay. And it's here to stay to 0%, and it's here to stay past zero. If you look to Europe, they did their best to manipulate the interest rate, like the central bank cash rate below zero, to get mortgage rates very close to zero. I don't know if Australia will see a negative mortgage rate unless it's some, 0% sort of promo thing where it's 0% for 1 year, but there's high fees. I don't think we'll quite get there, but I think mortgage interest rates between 1 and 2% in the second half of this decade seem likely to me. That's because housing markets go in cycles. Every housing market goes in cycles. A lot of people think they go in 18-year cycles, but sometimes they're 16 and sometimes they're 20 years.
Mm,
18 years since 2008 sort of bust is 2026. It seems reasonable to me, given the price trajectory we've seen, that there'll be some kind of rolling over of prices, either a big bust like the US housing market or a smaller one like Australia in the financial crisis. And so the central bank will have to respond with lower interest rates. I mean, they've got no other tools to use. Pardon me.
yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, that's my expectation. A booming few years with rising interest rates, next couple of years. Really sort of sketchy peak period where we all argue whether this is just a slowdown in an ever spiraling house price growth, and then after some sort of correction, mortgage interest rates between 1 and 2% in Australia.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And so I'll go for the final question then we're going to ask. Have you got a bit of a cough? Are you?
I don't know.
Are
It's
you?
just this room tonight. No, I
Okay.
haven't.
It's just yeah,
Yeah.
humid. Um, so
Yeah, I got the
Sophia.
fan blasting on me here.
Okay, that's it. So Sophia asks, should economists focus more on informing individual action and civil organisations rather than state policy? Wow, that's a good question.
Very good question. See, I'm I don't know how you call it. I'm organization agnostic, right? If the state does something well, okay, let it do it. If the state does something bad, but can sort of get out of that sector and the market does fine, like supermarkets or whatever, food distribution. I don't think we need a government to get involved in that. It seems to fulfill social needs pretty well. It's a robust, flexible system. Then markets do it. If we got up a bunch of sort of not-for-profit um, housing companies that could somehow get cheap housing going, yep, get them going. I think this where state involvement's important is where you really want to have sort of a collective decision about who gets things, right? Like, because private organizations always, none of them are going to be big enough to just satisfy everybody themselves. Pardon me. And so, if we're thinking about hospitals, yeah, you have private hospitals, great, but we should have public ones as well. And so, I'm the way I've sort of evolved on my thinking, and this is again, it's very simplified when you learn economics, fixed market failures with public regulation or public provision. But, sometimes you just try and start a public organization and it's really bad. The incentives are wrong, it doesn't work. And so now I'm in this view of we should be more experimenting and allowing an ecology of organizations to rise. And if there is a big, effective private organization, or many of them, then we should say, hey, we can either, for example, in housing, use their skills and create some kind of funding mechanism so that they can participate here, but we don't have to create the organization, or we're happy with how it is, or we regulate, or we subsidize certain people. So I think, Australia's stumbled into it in healthcare with this parallel public and private system, which works quite well. But I think that's where you want to go as well. I think you want to foster as many private organizations, businesses, associations, not-for-profits, whoever, church groups,
Yeah.
clubs. You want to foster an ecology of these things for people to self-organize, and you'll find successful organizations can arise. I don't think you want to have, even when the state produces things, I don't think they should smother alternatives. And that's again, it's just this competition idea, but it's also de-risking, right? You don't want the state to run something and it all fails for some political reason and there's nothing else there. So I guess I think about it in terms of like a rainforest. You want lots of different things growing up rather than a monoculture. But it's okay for the government to plant some big trees to sort of, have things hang off and grow on and feed off. So for example, when I think about cities and transport within cities, my view is, well, yeah, you can have a good rail network, but you should have lots and lots of different ways for people to get around,
Yeah.
right? You should have cycle paths, you should have buses, you should have rail. There should be many different ways to get to the airport, not just one. Because if that one breaks down, the city's stuck. So, and it's that same sort of principle of having lots of alternative ways to satisfy that human need. And the state involvement, I think, is really about, does the system we have, is it fair? Are we all happy with it? Can we use the state power to sort of redistribute wealth and money very easily? I mean, that's the thing governments do, put money in people's bank
Yeah.
accounts. They're really good at it, right?
Yeah.
It's cheap, the age pension system, amazing, right? But you wouldn't want to say you can't have any money when you're 65 because we've got an age pension, right? No, you just have an age pension, and if people can do whatever else they want, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, that's where my thinking has got to at this stage. It's a very it's very economicsy, like a bit of competition between public and private. I want like the school system. You should definitely have public schools, but doesn't mean you shouldn't allow private schools.
Yeah.
right? You should allow these new schools, and there's some in my area have just moved in. They're new schools. They cater to certain students who struggle in big public schools. Brilliant, brilliant. And if the government thinks the fair way to do schooling is by ensuring that every child has the same subsidy, then you should contribute to those private schools some kind of subsidy or some proportion of what you subsidize the public school. I mean, there's no reason you shouldn't have. I mean, that's a choice. But allowing those private organizations to flourish is, I think, important. And that's why I say the Austrians and whatnot, I think they have some good insights there on the emergence of private
Yeah.
organizations to satisfy particular things. We will just get together and do things
Yeah.
if we have the incentive to.
Well, I'm a huge fan of Eleanor Ostrom as well, who talked a lot about polycentricity, which is, I guess, a pretentious word for what you just said, which is having lots of different types of organisations, lots of levels, local governments, states, private organisations, co-ops, etc., etc. And they all need to be independent in some sense, but also interact and reinforce each other. And then you get, the problem you were talking about where, oh, I don't know, you get this in the States, right? One government comes in, they just abolish, reverse everything the previous government did. But if you have organizations that are
Yeah.
supporting that program and that policy that aren't dependent directly on the federal government, then
Mm.
you have less chance of that happening, right? Because there's more of a political base for the policy.
Yeah, exactly. It's good you mentioned Ellen Ostrom. She came across my mind earlier when you were saying something as well. And maybe we should wrap up on a sort of positive note about economics. Her
Mm-hmm.
Nobel Prize win was really, I feel like a watershed in terms of my confidence in terms of, wow, that's really how you just go and ask people how they organize,
Yeah.
and what rules they've come up and how they evolve. Like, to me, that was like, it inspired a lot of my thinking and it sort of gave me a bit more respect that, oh, there's actually people who really respect that sort of approach. And I'm going to try and incorporate, talking to people more and finding out how things really work. And so, yeah, that, as I said, economics discipline, I think because it's so big and so politically important, we can be very cynical about the monoculture and the 101isms.
Mm.
But it is so big, which means within it, there are really some super interesting contributions and super interesting connections with other disciplines. And so, the art is to find those people yourself and connect with them and cultivate them and support them and each other, and sort of almost be the change you want to be. I think that's the best you can do.
Mm.
Although I said, starting a new sort of discipline or a new university is, you know, it would work. I, I'm not going to do it. I don't see a critical mass there for it. So I think the thing to do is just be the best sort of, social scientist you can be in your discipline and stay open-minded and curious and don't stop evolving your understanding of things and ask the next question and, find out who's asked it before and where they got to and what new things you can find out. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is a very positive note to end on. So, yeah, thanks so much, Cameron. It was, yeah, we chatted for like 2 hours in the end, which is longer than I thought we would. So, this was great. Thanks for coming along, and
Mm.
I'm sure we will talk at some point in the future.
Yeah, for sure. I'll have to when travel opens up a little bit more. Yeah, we'll definitely catch up in person one of these
Yeah,
days.
yes, it would be great to meet in person. So I'll let you get
All
out
right.
of that humid room that's making you cough and get to bed. And thanks to
All right.
chat. Thank you, everyone. See you later, everyone. Bye.
Thanks.